Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Considerations for Psychological Counseling as a Related Services webinar. My name is Scott Seaman. I'm an educational consultant, school psychologist out of our Patton, Pittsburgh office. I'm also joined today with a number of co-presenters and panelists. We have Erica Caruta, Shonda Tarleen, and Drew Hunter out of the Harrisburg office, as well as Ronnie Russell, our resident expert on Medicaid billing out of Harrisburg, and Gina Spicknell-Cook out of our East office. So what we'd like to do is give you some basic information before we begin. The session today is part one of two, and this session will run from 12 o'clock p.m. to 3:15 p.m. with 15-minute break. Tomorrow, March 16th, will be part two of the two series, and this will run from, again, 12 to 3:15. In order to earn credit, please keep in mind the following. Participants must log in individually from a computer or iPad to the webinar on time. You want to make sure to stay for both duration of the webinar and complete an attendance and evaluation survey by the designated deadline in order to be eligible for Act 48 credit. No credit will be awarded for those who attend by phone or audio alone. All of the handouts for today and tomorrow's sessions can be found on a Padlet, which you'll be able to find in the chat box. And we will make sure to put that into the chat box throughout the day. Our panelists will be posting that link in the chat shortly. This will be the same link for tomorrow's handouts as well. Some of the things that you can find in the Padlet would include the publications for psychological counseling as a related service, as well as today's presentation PowerPoint for part one, and for tomorrow's PowerPoint for part two. Also, you'll find another additional resources on the Padlet as well, dealing with progress monitoring, telehealth services, data to help teams advocate for expanded roles, some dealing with mental health and well-being resources for students, families, and educators, as well as a Padlet portion on the National Center on Intensive Intervention. It's related to psychological counseling as related services, and then also a site for the Department of Human Services resources that we'll take a look at today's presentation with regards to Medicaid billing and psychological counseling as a related service. Please also know that all participants currently are muted and cameras are off. We will be recording these sessions. Please allow 3 weeks for the recording to be posted to the Patton YouTube channel on the School Psychologist playlist. If you have any questions, please send that to the panelists in the chat box. We do have nearly about 400 individuals registered for the session today, so we will be able to take a few questions. So we're going to go ahead and begin. So Patton's, get rid of our faces here. There we go. So first, our Pennsylvania Department of Education commitment to least restrictive environment. Our goal at Patton is for each child is to ensure the individualized education program teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. Our mission at Patton is to support the efforts and the initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. This training is not meant to be legal counsel, so please consult with your LEA for legal advice and policy and procedural considerations. The objectives for today would be, we're going to cover 4 topics or objectives: the legal basis for psychological counseling as a related service, followed by medical assistance billing and psychological counseling in the NAS practice model, psychological counseling as a related service, and the implications for practice. When considering the legal basis for psychological counseling as a related service, we get our information from the Individuals with Disability Education Act 2004. Essentially, it defines related services as follows that you can see on the screen. Transportation, such developmental, corrective, and other supportive services required to assist a child with a disability to benefit from special education and include speech and language pathology, audiology services, interpreting services, psychological services, physical and occupational therapy, recreation, also including therapeutic recreation, early identification and assessment of children with disabilities, counseling services, which also includes rehabilitative counseling, as well as orientation and mobility, medical services for diagnostic and evaluation purposes, and also includes the services of school health, as well as school nursing services, school social work services, and parent and counseling and training. We're really talking kind of about an umbrella of service providers. We're talking about counseling, school social work services, psychological services, and as we said, parent counseling and training. Counseling services really means services provided by qualified social workers, psychologists, school counselors, and other qualified personnel. When we think of it in this regard, related services are included in the IEP and ensure that a student benefits from educational programming and are intended to support the student and the parent. IDEA provides for the provision of counseling services, as we said, school psychological services and parent training as well. So, who are the qualified personnel to provide such services? School social workers, school counselors, school psychologists, and any contracted agency personnel the intermediate unit of the school district or school would designate as appropriate for filling that role. Psychological services, as defined by IDEA, are more encompassing than counseling services and can include the following: somebody with the ability to administer tests and other assessment procedures, interpreting assessment results, integrating and interpreting the information about the conditions pertaining to child learning, consulting with other staff members to plan programming to meet student needs, managing a program of psychological service for students and parents, including psychological counseling for children and parents, as well as assisting in the developing of positive behavior intervention strategies. Now, if we think about it from the context of school psychology, this points really to everything that a school psychologist can do within the school system. Also, we know that when we consider school social work services, that our colleagues that are school social workers also have a vast variety of skill sets. Preparing a social and developmental history on a child with a disability. They can provide group and individualized counseling with the child and the family. You can also work in partnerships with parents and other agencies on those problems in the child's living situation, such as a home, in the school, or in the community that affect the child's adjustment in school. Also, they can mobilize school and community resources to help enable the child to learn as effectively as possible and coordinate the services from inside and outside the district as well as assisting in developing the positive behavior intervention plans. IDEA also includes the provision of parent counseling and training. In this regard, we're speaking about assisting parents in the understanding and the needs of the child, providing parent with information about child development, helping parents acquire the necessary skills to support the implementation of their child's IEP. This should be directly related to the child's IEP and the individual educational needs. Remember, this is not therapy or counseling for the parent. Psychological counseling in this regard is more to assist the parent with regards to accessing and have an understanding of the skills that are necessary to provide to the students so they can be successful. Also, when we think of psychological counseling and equitable access, we're thinking about barriers to accessing services outside of school, parent training and access, ensuring high-risk student groups have access to services, and making sure that services are available in a language the parents can understand. Now, when we think of what is the role perhaps of a school psychologist in ensuring equitable access, we know that school psychologists can lead the effort to embed equity into everything that we do, consistent with the examination of data, with a focus on racial equity, access to services and supports. School psychologists, we know, can also bring equity conversations to the meetings at the table in several ways, encourage other educators to build relationships with each student, questioning and rethinking of the routine so that all students feel safe and have a sense of belonging, sharing resources and information about implicit bias, as well as an awareness of privilege when recommending what students need. Also, fourthly, really when we think of culturally responsive practices, school psychologists can model affirming language, relationship building with families, and culturally responsive classroom management strategies. Now what we're going to do is take a look at the second objective that we spoke about, And here we're talking about medical assistance, the allowable psychological counseling as a related service billing questions. We're lucky today to have a resident expert, Pat Harrisburg, Ronnie Russell, who's going to be taking over this next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Scott. And you can move to the next slide. Thank you. So welcome, everyone. And again, I'm so glad to be able to be here today to talk to you about Medicaid and billing services that you may provide to your students with IEPs. Again, if a lot of this is foreign to you, please ask your special education director, or maybe even some of your special ed teachers are aware of this program in your school district. And hopefully you do have this program in your school district and you are billing to Medicaid to get some reimbursement dollars back into your district to help your students. So let's look particularly at psych services and how a lot of these other services, like Scott spoke about, interrelate with one another. We are going to be talking mostly about psych counseling or school psychology services. But again, it's helpful, as Scott mentioned, to talk about social work and psychiatric services and what those look like and what they would be providing. And again, I'm not going to reread these to you, as I think that Scott did a great job of going over what each one of those is. So next slide. Okay, so as you see here, this is actually our Department of Human Services, which is one of the Department of Ed's partners, of course, in this program, and they're the ones that have rolled out our school-based access program and manage it day to day with our vendor. You see here on the screen what you need to have to provide psychological services. And again, all of this information that's being presented to you about Medicaid billing is in the school-based access handbook that is on the Padlet link. So again, you'll have that as a reference to go back to. You see there at the top that everything is related back to a code of regulations from the federal government. And so that's how our handbook is laid out. And you see that psychological services must be provided by either a licensed psychologist or a Department of Education, Pennsylvania Department of Education certified school psychologist. And the service is given to either an individual or group, which would be 2 or more students. And that would have to be in the student's IEP that way. Is it individual or group? To be able to bill. Again, you also see throughout all of these services that can be billed to Medicaid that there must be a prescription. And that's where you see there that a licensed medical doctor, a licensed DO, or a licensed CRNP with a prescriptive component to their licensure would be able to sign off on these services. Again, I can't say it enough from the special education lens that a free appropriate public education comes first, but it is also helpful if you can also bill to Medicaid to get some money back in your district for these services. Next slide. So just some examples, and Scott went over some of these already, and hopefully some of you are doing these and are saying, wait, I can get some money back in our district for this. So administering evaluations and assessments, individual therapy or counseling that you, again, might be providing, especially now during the pandemic, group therapy or counseling, especially crisis assistance right now. Or any type of skills training to improve that social interaction with others. Again, this list is just an example. It's not an end-all be-all list. So there are things that you might be doing as a school psychologist that aren't on this list. And again, it would be whatever within your scope of practice. Next slide. So documentation is key, and we talk about this a lot in this program. It's one thing to provide the service, but to be compliant when you are actually billing to Medicaid for services, you must have parental consent from the parent to actually bill to Medicaid insurance, if you will. It must be documented in the IEP. You must keep a daily log and attendance records. Even if you're doing a makeup session with a student, you need to document that. Again, school districts that are in this program must ensure that they have you as the provider's licensure and or certification. And what if you were ever audited, what they would look for would actually be an evaluation report that shows the work you actually did with the student. Next slide. All records must be legible, and what's been helpful is that some people still use paper pencil, but most of it is now electronic. So the legibility is not so much of an issue as it used to be in the past. The date and any signature to changes that are made must be in the record. Plans must be part of the student's permanent record, the IEP, the treatment plan, or your evaluation reports. You must document progress. It could just be maintaining, but again, that's progress. And then you must sign and date that documentation. And the thing to note here, when we talk about outside of our special education records, all of these records must comply with medical assistance regulations. And record retention of these records, Pennsylvania regulations state that the records must be kept at a minimum of 4 years, whereas federal requires 6. And they must fully disclose the nature and extent of the services rendered and must be readily available for looking at if there's ever an audit. Next slide. So I think that these next few slides are really pertinent to pay attention to, especially if you are already participating in the Medicaid billing program. So there's been a lot of questions over the past few years in regards to explaining evaluations. We used to have an evaluation chart. And so from that feedback, we really looked at putting this out actually in annotated form instead of a chart to better explain it. And so they've added some subsections and subheadings in this portion of the handbook, which again, you can refer to. And I think you see highlighted here, evaluations are when a health-related service is identified and documented in the IEP. And the thing to note here is that evaluations that identify the need for special education services, but not for health-related services, are not billable to Medicaid. So again, the free appropriate public education comes first. And then if there is a health-related service that the child gets, then your evaluation service could be billed. And so the authorization for an evaluation, again, must be authorized or prescribed by those folks, a licensed MD, DO, or a CRNP with prescriptive authority. So licensed practitioners you see here, including licensed psychologists, licensed social workers, licensed professional counselors, can sign medical authorizations for services or evaluations within their scope of practice. So that's a good thing to note. And again, this medical authorization and the parental consent to bill has to happen first before a provider within the school district can bill. Again, this isn't on here, but I think a thing to also note is when school districts are in this program, they are actually the provider of service on record for what we call provider type 35. So the school-based program sits alone under the Department of Human Services, provider type 35. So you as a provider working in a school district, you are providing professional services to a child, but the provider that is noted with the Department of Human Services and the federal government is the school district. Next slide. So for initial evaluations, and again, we get questions about this a lot also. Again, it was helpful to note that we want to ensure that we maintain the separation between IDEA, special education requirements, and Medicaid requirements. So again, you see here, an initial evaluation occurs anytime the student is evaluated or assessed in a service type under which they have not been previously evaluated. So for example, if I am adding a related service, let's say like social work, to an already existing IEP, that would be an initial evaluation. So when you have that parental consent and medical authorization at the time of the evaluation, and there is at least one ongoing health-related service, then this initial evaluation may be billed. It could be billed also in early intervention and school-age programs. And then at the very bottom there, you see an initial psychological evaluation conducted solely to determine a student's eligibility for special education services may not be billed. The key is to make sure that there's a health-related service that goes along with that in order to bill it. Next slide. So then the third part of this, again, is our reevaluations. So same thing as evaluation, but anytime that a student is evaluated or assessed in a service type under which they are currently receiving or had previously received services, again, as with anything else, it's only compensable when there's that parental consent, medical authorization, and a current IEP, and that there's an ongoing health-related covered service. And health-related covered service would be things like occupational therapy, physical therapy, nursing services, just to give you some examples. And again, this is all in the handbook. And so a note, which is very important there at the bottom, is a psychological reevaluation conducted solely to determine a student's ongoing eligibility for special education is not billable. However, I do often see that most of our students do have an additional ongoing health-related service. So your services in regards to evaluation would be billable. Next slide. And so we bill things based on a unit of service, if you're not familiar with that. So all initial evals and reevals are billed upon a per evaluation unit of service. And again, for early intervention initial evaluations, the date of service is the IEP meeting date or the child's third birthday, whichever is later. School age initial evaluations, again, is the date of service, is the IEP meeting date. And again, when a service is being added to an existing IEP, the date of service used for billing is the initial service type evaluation. And it would be the last date the evaluation activities with the student were performed. So if an evaluation takes you a couple days, it would be that last date that you finished it up. The other thing I want to note, because this was mentioned by Scott, is I know we're just talking primarily about psychological services and who's eligible, but I think it's helpful to note that social work services, if that's listed as a related service, must be provided by a licensed social worker, a licensed professional counselor, or a licensed marriage and family therapist. And then psychiatric services, which we don't see a lot, but they still are out there and folks are providing them. They are provided by a licensed physician with a specialty in psychiatry. That would be the licensure that they would hold. And again, just to remind you, the School-Based Access Program Handbook is on the Padlet link that was provided to you today. So again, if you have any questions or need to refer back to some of these slides, it really does lay out for you the overarching parameters of the program. And again, I hope that you all are participating in this. And if you're not, please ask your special education director how maybe your school district can get involved in this program, and reach out to the Department of Human Services or our vendor, which is Public Consulting Group. And again, you can email me if you have questions. Thank you.
Ronnie, thank you very much. We really appreciate your presentation. And it does seem like there are some questions in the chat. Erica, could you take some of those questions for us, please?
Sure. So we did have a couple questions in the Q&A. I think somewhat you've addressed these, but just to kind of clarify for folks. So one question was, So a medical prescription is required for a student in order to receive psychological services, or is it that just a provider can recommend those services? That's one question.
So good question. So as I noted, that if the services being provided all have to have that parental consent and a medical prescription. Most often, school districts either are on contract with a medical a doctor, a DO, or a certified registered nurse practitioner with prescriptive authority. Not all CRNPs have prescriptive authority. I know I did mention that that a psychologist within their scope of practice could recommend and sign off on the med-off just for their service alone, and that is true if they meet all the qualifications. Again, if you have further questions about that, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Okay, and two more quick questions that popped in. So does the ER and IEP count as our prescription?
Good question. The ER and IEP is documentation of it, but there is a separate form called the medical authorization form. So think of it this way. You have your related services listed on your updated IEP, and that information is basically taken from the IEP and put onto the medical authorization. So whomever's signing off on that authorization or prescription, as we call it, sees that the child's getting, psych counseling one time a week or one time a month, or they're receiving speech therapy 30 minutes, a month, or whatever that is. So it basically replicates what's on the IEP.
Couple more. Is formal mental health therapy in a private school considered a counseling service?
Is mental health therapy in a private school? Say it again.
Is formal mental health therapy in a private school considered a counseling service?
Okay, so when you say private to me, I'm not sure what that means because the only folks that can bill in this program right now are our public schools, charter schools, and intermediate units. And again, our EI providers, but no private schools.
Yep.
So I'm not sure how to answer the rest of that.
Yeah, no, I think you got it. Like a non-public school that doesn't get federal funding. So I think you got it. Perfect.
Okay.
Okay. How are you differentiating between a psychological evaluation and a psychoeducational evaluation?
It might be semantics, so it's probably the same thing. So again, I think the biggest overarching thing to remember is that doing an evaluation or reevaluation just to decide if the child is still eligible, the two-pronged criteria for special education is not, you could not bill an evaluation for that purpose. But if the child has, let's say, speech therapy and you're documenting if they're still in need of special education, then it's billable.
Okay. Awesome. And then I think we had one more. The prescription is only needed if submitting for MA, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yep. And again, that is why I said, and I know folks hate this, but that is why a free, appropriate public education comes first.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can bill Medicaid for those same services and get some of that money back for services that children are eligible for anyway, and you're providing anyway, good on you. And I'm proud of you for doing that.
Okay, awesome. We'll just take two more quick ones, and then I know we'll probably need to move on. This question popped up. Can psychologists with PA certification sign off on authorization, or only licensed psychologists? So I'm thinking that means school psychologists because we're certified versus licensed, and some are both, they're certified and licensed.
Yeah, I would say licensed.
Okay. And we will talk about, okay, there's a lot more coming in. What services can a non-licensed school counselor provide?
Good question. So when we talk about school counseling,
Yes.
school counselors are not eligible to bill in our Medicaid program.
And
Okay.
then we'll take one more quick one. They're just popping in. I'm trying to keep up with them. Section 313, social work and counseling services section. Does billing differ from psychologist billing?
So as professionals, you pretty much should know what's in your scope of practice. Again, even in the manual or the handbook when it was written, it's just some examples. So there might be things not listed in there that you're providing. But again, I would hope that you know what your scope of practice is within your licensure. And so that's why it's not an end-all be-all list of examples. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it probably would be something billable if in fact you have the proper credentials, you're a licensed social worker, licensed professional counselor, and you're providing something within your scope of practice to a student with an IEP.
Okay, awesome. And this one is a little bit different. This will be the last one, I promise.
Okay.
If a student is receiving counseling or another related service from a provider outside of the school system, can both the school system and the outside provider bill access?
Right. So great question. So oftentimes, a lot of our students are going to intermediate unit classroom to get, or maybe they're getting speech, let's say, from an intermediate unit, but they're also getting all of their other services at their home school district. So the IU or the other entity and the school district would share and can share the same medical authorizations, just as long as it looks the same, it's signed off, and all of the students' services are on there. And then yes, they both could bill. A lot of times when school districts that are in this program are on contract with an outside provider, let's say for occupational therapy, that's a common one. They will in the contract say, as per this contract, we're asking for you to give us logs so we can bill services for this child to Medicaid.
Okay, awesome. So thank you so much. What
Absolutely.
we'll do is we will put Ronnie's contact information is at the end of the slide deck. I will also put that in the chat. So if you have additional questions for Ronnie, please reach out and she will be happy to help you with that. So thanks so much, everyone, for great questions.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Erica, very much. What we're going to do is switch out the technology at this point, and Dr. Drew Hunter out of our Harrisburg office is going to take us through the 6 pillars of allowable psychological services in the NASS practice model. Drew, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. All right. I'll just take a moment here to get my screen set up for everybody. Okay. All right. Oh, I didn't want to go ahead yet. So we're going to really transition and focus for the remainder of the webinar, specifically on psychological services as it's defined in IDEA. And we're going to look at kind of how the services outlined in IDEA maybe match up with our NASS practice model and look at some evidence-based practices that may also match up to those as well. And then we'll kind of finish out with a little bit of tips for implementing these sorts of things at your sites going forward. So when we're talking, if we remember when we looked at psychological services, there were kind of 6 allowable services that you can kind of write and provide in an IEP for a student. We've come to call these the 6 pillars of psychological services. Dr. Hillary Mangus really came up with that. She's not on the call today. She's out of our Pittsburgh office, but she just kind of started calling it that. And we really liked it and it stuck. So we just kind of went ahead and used that for our presentation. But when we look at those services, we're really talking about administering assessments, obtaining and interpreting assessments results, integrating assessment results and information about child learning, consultation with school personnel around program planning for students, managing a program of psychological services, including psychological counseling, and that can include parent counseling as well, and then positive behavioral interventions and developing those supports and plans for students in schools as well. So these are the 6 allowable services that fall under the umbrella of psychological services that could, a team could decide a student may be in need of and that a school psychologist could provide in a school district. So when we look at our NASP practice model, we can see that there's considerable overlap there, right? And if there's anyone on the webinar today that's not a school psychologist, NASP is the National Association of School Psychologists. And in May of 2020, NASP adopted the NASP 2020 professional standards, which included the model for comprehensive and integrated school psychological services. And this is also known as the NASP practice model. The purpose of the NASP practice model is to advance the most consistent implementation of school psychological services, as well as to help ensure their maximum effectiveness, efficiency, and quality in schools nationwide. So we feel that the psychological services that are outlined in IDEA match fairly well with what NASP recommends, how NASP recommends, I should say, that school psychologists should be functioning in a school. And when you kind of look at the Venn diagram we have here, we've kind of mapped some of those services onto certain domains. We're going to look a little bit more in depth about maybe how each pillar of psychological services matches specific areas of the NASP practice model and what that might mean for us as school psychologists practicing in schools. All right. So when we think of pillar 1, administering psychological and educational tests and other assessment procedures, this really maps on to domain 1. If you want to look at the NASP practice model too while we're going through this, I do believe we have a link to that in the Padlet. And if not, a quick Google search can take you right to the main page there on NASP that outlines all these things. And as we're going through this too, I kind of highlighted some areas that seem to really fit, but there are certainly maybe some things that I missed here and other areas or other domains that match each pillar as well. But in terms of administering those assessments, we know that a main role of school psychologists in schools is to conduct valid and reliable assessments. And one of the reasons we do this is for the purpose of identifying students' eligibility for special education services. However, assessment practices conducted by school psychologists aren't limited solely to special education eligibility and MDE evaluations, right? School psychologists can conduct assessments for a wide variety of reasons outside of that. And when we look at our NASP practice model under domain 1, they're pretty specific that we should be systematically collecting data from multiple sources as a foundation for decision making at not just the individual level, but at the group and systems level as well. And so in practice, so as Ronnie had mentioned, certainly those initial evaluations and reevaluations represent a time where psychologists could be administering assessments as part of psychological services for a student as well. However, when we think about everything else that goes into IEPs in terms of progress monitoring, present levels of performance, et cetera, it is possible that school psychologists could be providing some sort of ongoing assessment services to students who are already identified, right? So we don't want to just limit ourselves to only be involved in assessment that identifies students for special education as well. There is room in IDEA and the NASP practice model for school psychologists to provide ongoing assessment services for students once they're already identified. So in thinking about pillar 2, interpreting assessment results, this also kind of really harkens back to domain 1 again. And when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about school psychologists understanding and utilizing assessment methods for identifying strengths and needs, developing effective interventions, services and programs, and measuring progress and outcomes within a multi-tiered systems of support, or again, within special education programming. Additionally, school psychologists are going to use a problem-solving framework as the basis for all professional activities. They're going to systematically collect data from multiple sources as a foundation for decision-making. And then we're also going to consider ecological factors such as classroom, family, and community characteristics as the context for assessment and intervention. So as part of a school-based team, school psychologists many times are the professional at the table that has the most training and expertise in a variety of different assessment methods. And not just in administering those assessment methods, but being able to interpret those assessment for the purpose of really matching students' needs to specific interventions, could be goals, services, SDI, etc. So again, as part of an ongoing psychological service that school psychologists can provide, one of those things could be supporting IEP teams in interpreting assessment results that are administered at various times, whether that be progress monitoring assessments, or maybe more annual assessments looking at student present levels. So again, just kind of another nod to there's a lot more that we can be doing in terms of assessments than just identifying students for those initial provisions of services and conducting reevaluations for continued eligibility. All right, so in pillar 3, we're thinking about obtaining, integrating, and interpreting information about a child's behavior and conditions related to learning. And in addition to domain 1, this one really, to me, the other domains that stood out here were domains 3, 4, and 5. And some items there to highlight would be use of that problem-solving framework as the basis for all practices, systematically collecting those data from multiple sources, using assessment data to understand students' problems, as well as to implement evidence-based instructional, mental, and behavioral health services. The use of data to analyze progress toward meeting academic and behavioral goals, evaluating treatment fidelity of student interventions, and evaluating the effectiveness and/or need for modifications to school interventions. So when I think about this, I think about kind of this ongoing data collection process. And as part of that ongoing data collection process, it's making sure that we're evaluating the effectiveness of the services and supports that we put in place for students, not just in terms of are they showing the growth and the increase in either those academic or social emotional domains, but also measuring fidelity of interventions as well, and making sure that students are getting the high quality services that we are recommending be put into place for them. And again, this is another way that school psychologists can provide ongoing support to students and teams once students are identified and receiving special education services. So pillar 4 is a reference to consultation in terms of consulting with other staff members and planning school programs to meet special education needs of children, as indicated by psychological tests, interviews, direct observation, and behavioral evaluations. Right? So this seems to cover a lot of the NASH practice model domains, including 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Most prominent is probably that we are to be using a consultative problem-solving process for planning, implementing, and evaluating all instructional, mental, and behavioral health services. Additionally, school psychologists should be able to facilitate effective communication and collaboration among teachers, families, and community providers, and other personnel that are involved in supporting students. School psychologists should be able to use consultation and collaboration, not just when working with individual students and trying to solve individual student level problems, but also at the classroom, school, or systems level. And additionally, school psychologists are asked to advocate for needed change at the individual student classroom building, district, state, or national levels. So when we think about consultation as part of a comprehensive set of school psychological services, it's very broad and can involve, again, focusing on individual student problems, working to improve the functioning of a classroom as a whole. Example might be working with classroom management techniques, or also consultation at systems level too. And if you may be wondering how that relates back to special education services too, remember, our charge is to educate students in the least restrictive environment. And part of being able to effectively support students in that least restrictive environment means that may mean that we need to be able to develop the capacity, not just of individual teachers that we're working with, but also classrooms and maybe our school systems as a whole. So it could be running the gamut of consulting on an individual behavior plan to consulting on evidence-based classroom management techniques, to also providing consultation on like positive behavior intervention and support systems, all with the design of increasing the capacity at all levels of the school to support student functioning. All right, Wendy had a question in the chat, it just popped up and I saw that in regards to pillar 2. So in terms, her question is, what method of permission do you recommend that teams use when psychologists are conducting assessments for IEP/MTSS, etc.? Wendy, we're going to talk a little bit more about how you document this in day 2 tomorrow, but unless anyone else has another opinion, I would say it's how that's documented in the IEP, right? So if you're providing a related service to a student, it should be documented in the IEP, and that family or parent should be made aware of that, and then they're going to sign the NORAP indicating agreement with those supports and services. So this would be different from like the permission that you would be seeking to do psychoeducational evaluations, right? That type of permission that we need to get signed legally for that. This is more of an ongoing process that you would be engaging with, either with the student or the team, depending if you're administering or just interpreting and consulting on those assessments. And it should be outlined in the IEP and documented there and discussed with the parent, and they can either agree or disagree to those services. Dr. Kruger, did you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to put another question in here from the Q&A. Is there a standard assessment tool that can be used to qualify a student to receive social work services? Or is the assessment that shows they need services provided through what is done by the school psychologist through their RR or ER?
Are you pitching that to me?
I am. Yeah, we can both kind of take it. Do you have some thoughts? And I can write.
I do. So one of the things I'm thinking of too is when we think about social work services, we have to think about what kind of falls under social work services that would be kind of uniquely different from like the counseling services and the psychological services, right? Because some of those are going to be similar. And if we're talking about something like a individual counseling or a group counseling or that type of intervention, right? That is a need that can be identified through whatever assessment methods you typically use when you're conducting your evaluation report to determine and pull out those needs, whether that be behavior rating scales, interviews, FBAs. You're saying this student needs this type of service. And then that really would, again, we're kind of shifting, fast forwarding into day 2 content. That's going to come down to the IEP to determine who's going to deliver that service and how it's going to get coded there, whether it's the counselor, psychologist, or social worker. In terms of some of those other ones that are kind of unique to social workers, I'm not really aware of, again, a standard tool that would use to identify students for needing that, but I'm thinking that that stuff should come through maybe in some of like your interview data with teachers, families, maybe some of your records review and some of that data. Would you add anything to that, Dr. Kruger?
No, 100% agree. There's not a standard tool that comes out. It really is consideration of all of the different administration information coming in, and then matched to whatever that identified need is, and the specific services that school social workers can provide.
All right.
Yeah, great. Okay, I think we're good. All right.
All right.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, and then moving on, looking at pillar 5 here. We're talking, and pillar 5 refers to planning and managing a program of psychological services, including psychological counseling for students and parents. So some of the domains that jump out here would be domains 4, 5, and 6. And what we're talking about are understanding biological, cultural, developmental, and social influences on mental and behavioral health, and behavioral and emotional impacts on learning, as well as some evidence-based strategies to promote social emotional functioning. Right? Additionally, the practice model says that in collaboration with others, school psychologists should design, implement, and evaluate services that promote resilience and positive behavior, support socialization and adaptive skills, and enhance mental and behavioral health. Also thinking about collaborating with and engaging parents in decision-making about their children. promoting respect and appropriate services for cultural and linguistic differences, and promoting strategies for safe, nurturing, and dependable parenting at home, as well as interventions to support that. And we also want to create links among schools, family, and community providers. So in this particular pillar of psych services, there's a lot of room for direct intervention with students in a variety of forms for direct counseling services, as well as supporting parents. Again, and we think about that parent counseling, about trying to engage parents and help them understand how they can help their students maximize access to their education through the IEP. That may involve some direct work with parents or some conjoint behavioral consultation with parents and teachers. But again, just going a little more broad in that it's not always just about individual students and those types of direct services. Another piece of this really is working with our school systems to make sure that we're promoting resilience and positive emotional and behavioral health at the school as a whole, because anything we do there is going to help support our individual student efforts be much more successful. And then thinking about our final pillar, pillar 6, is about assisting in developing positive behavioral intervention strategies. And in thinking about some of the things in the practice model domains 4 and 6, we're talking about being able to design in collaboration with others, always in collaboration with others. We're looking at implementing and evaluating services that are going to promote resilience, positive behavior support, socialization, and adaptive skills, as well as enhancing mental and behavioral health. School psychologists should also understand principles of research related to social emotional well-being, resilience and risk factors in learning and mental health and behavioral health, services in schools and communities to support multi-tiered prevention and health promotion, and evidence-based strategies for creating safe and supportive schools. Also, in collaboration with others, we want to promote preventative and responsive services that enhance learning, mental and behavioral health, and psychological and physical safety, and implement effective crisis prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recoveries. All right. So here, again, we can expand this beyond just individual behavior support plans to those more broad indicators or systems levels, areas that support positive behavior functioning for all students and the target students that we're working with. And we feel that domain 10, the legal, ethical, and professional practices, really kind of encompasses all of our psychological services, right? So school psychologists should demonstrate skills to provide services consistent with ethical, legal, and professional standards. They should engage in responsive and ethical professional decision-making, collaborate with other professionals, and apply professional work characteristics needed for effective practice as school psychologists. This is going to include respect for human diversity and social justice, communication skills, effective interpersonal skills, responsibility, adaptability, initiative, dependability, and technology skills. And that is quite the professional mandate there. But some other things that kind of also fall under this domain 10 are keeping knowledgeable about ethical and professional standards and legal regulations. Also, assisting other school personnel, including administrators and parents, in understanding the relevant regulations to general and special education as well. And then as school psychologists, in order to meet the needs of our schools, communities, and students, does require engaging in professional development and lifelong learning. And whenever possible, we want to utilize supervision and mentoring for effective practices, right? So we know that the most effective way to learn a new skill is to get some kind of learning about it and then have some kind of supervised support with that skill as you're implementing that. And again, we feel that this kind of encompasses all of the pillars of practice. Everything that we do is underpinned by legal, ethical, and professional practices.
Please do keep in mind that when we think about psych counseling as a related service, this really is Chapter 14 under special education. So school psychologists, for example, are required personnel under Chapter 14 services. So you may hear a little bit more about school psychologists. That's one of the reasons why, but we will get into more depth tomorrow about how we can partner school social workers, even special education teachers, how we all have a place in that continuum of services. So stay tuned. That's your plug to come back tomorrow. And then there were a couple more questions in the chat about MA billing, and Ronnie is going to get to those. So she'll reply to those, or in the Q&A part, she'll reply to those in a little bit for you.
Awesome. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. So yeah, again, to echo what Erica was saying, we are, while IDEA does provide provisions for personnel other than school psychologists, and we are touching on some of those things in this training as well. A lot of this is geared more towards school psychologists, but that's not to say that there's an information that's being covered today and tomorrow that won't be applicable to guidance counselors, school social workers, and other qualified personnel as supporting a continuum of psych services or a program of psych services in your district. So moving forward, we're going to discuss the implications for practice that some of the related services, particularly psychological services outlined in IDEA, have for practitioners. So what IDEA is really suggesting is that school psychologists, social workers, school counselors, and other qualified personnel, that we should be providing a continuum of services to eligible students as outlined in IDEA. And we kind of feel that this continuum of services is probably best situated within a multi-tiered system of support. Remembering that the purpose of a multi-tiered system of support is to allocate available resources in a district to best meet student needs. So in thinking about Pennsylvania's MTSS model, it's rooted in a problem-solving model. So according to the NASS practice domains, the problem-solving process really should permeate all aspects of a school psychologist's functioning. So the allowable psychological services in IDEA, in addition to IEP requirements that include the identification of present levels, SDI, goals related to identify student needs, and the ongoing progress monitoring requirements of students with IEPs, this really does kind of provide some legal support for the application of that problem-solving process to students identified for special education, right? So we're to be using data to identify their strengths and needs, identify their present levels of performance. We're to be using that data to match the student to services, supports, interventions, etc. We're to set measurable goals, and then we're to monitor student progress towards those goals. The purpose being that if our supports don't appear to be benefiting the student, then we're supposed to revisit what supports we're providing and maybe intensify, add additional services, etc. All right. And the use of problem-solving processes within an MTSS framework also helps to ensure equitable service delivery. In an equitable service delivery model, students are going to receive the support they need regardless, right? And equity in practice is going to move away from bias in decision-making and away from differential treatment through that multi-tiered system of support. So we want to make sure that there's equitable instruction in all skill areas, including academic, behavioral, and social emotional. So when thinking about the most intensive level of a multi-tiered system of support, which is where we're going to find where most of our students identified for special education are going to fall, that's going to include students that have ongoing and intensive educational needs. So some of these students are going to be identified in your systems as eligible for special education services, and others may not be. But regardless of whether they're identified or not, we know that these students are going to benefit from similar interventions and a similar provision of psychological services. And since special education is a service, it's not a location, it's not a specific teacher, right? The provision of services for identified and unidentified students should really only vary by the intensity and individualization of the services, as opposed to who delivers the service or what program or service is being used as the basis of the intervention. So in this way, if we think about it, the provision of well-implemented continuum of psychological services is kind of part of an effort to expand the role and functioning of the school psychologist beyond just eligibility determinations, as well as to use our unique training and skills to best support the needs of all learners in our schools. So as we can see here, the psych services outlined in IDEA are really similar to how a school psychologist would function if they were functioning within a well-developed MTSS system. So within a multi-tiered system of support, we're going to be collaborating with problem-solving teams, right, to collect screening data, progress monitoring data, diagnostic data, and analyze that data to inform student needs. Possibly within a continuum of psychological services, we'd be doing that same thing. We're just collaborating with IEP teams to use those data from possibly multidisciplinary evaluations or just annual updates of present levels to, again, identify those student needs and match them to interventions. So within an MTSS, we may be consulting on effective practices at the system, group, and individual level. Effective curricula, effective intervention, and effective data-based individualization of interventions. Similarly, we can consult on the development of individual education plans as well and make those same types of recommendations as to what types of interventions are going to best meet those students' needs. So again, on the MTSS side of things, we may consult on the development of those individual student support plans. When we're dealing with psychological services, we're going to probably be consulting on effective practices to support the student learning, behavior, and social emotional well-being that occurs in a variety of settings to support our students, again, in that least restrictive environment. We may also be helping IEP teams to interpret progress monitoring data, similar to how we might function with an MTSS team. And hopefully there's room in our service provider continuum, our continuum of services to provide some direct intervention to students as well. As part of a group of people who may have similar backgrounds or training that are providing, again, that comprehensive support to all students. And we would hope that these two processes would be integrated into like a single system as well, right? So when dealing with students who may be identified for special education services and receiving those services through an individualized education plan, there are going to be additional requirements that need to be attended to if we're adjusting those students' interventions. But there's no reason that the monitoring of those students and the provision of their service delivery can't exist within an MTSS framework, right? Again, possibly with these students representing the most intense and individualized supports available within the school and having that ongoing support through the IEP with the legal protections as well. So that would be really the only difference there, right? So we're providing the same set of services to students that have similar needs in a similar manner, just making sure that we're attending to those legal requirements that have to be attended to when supporting students with IEPs. All right. So, and in an attempt to clearly link psychological services to the day-to-day activities of school psychologists, we kind of went through our 6 pillars and matched some evidence-based practices that we feel align with those 6 defined psychological services as outlined in IDEA. So these are the tools of the trade, so to speak. And although many of us get trained in a broad kind of service delivery model in graduate school, sometimes in practice, we can be afforded limited opportunities to use some of those skills. However, these skills are dynamic and essential, and really, if you're going to provide that continuum of psychological services as outlined in IDEA, some of these services are going to have to be things that we're going to use. So when we're looking at the problem-solving process, as stated before, that's really going to be applicable to every pillar, right? The problem-solving process permeates everything we do as school psychologists. When we're looking at pillars 1, 2, and 3, we're thinking kind of about administering assessments or interpreting assessments or kind of integrating assessment results and what that means for student learning environments. And here, curriculum-based assessment and functional behavior assessment seem like good school psychology services that fit those 3 pillars. And the curriculum-based assessment and functional behavior assessment may also be tools that we use as part of a consultation process with teachers and school teams as well. So collecting that data that we're defining in consultation and monitoring those interventions that we're putting in place. In managing those psychological services and the psychological counseling, group counseling and individual counseling are going to be applicable here for pillar 5. And then again, for pillar 6, we're kind of back to that functional behavior assessment paradigm in terms of what we can do to support students at that level and that particular aspect of psychological services. All right. So when we think about the problem-solving process, we're thinking about the application of the scientific method and database decision-making to everyday problems encountered in schools. We want to be using those processes to clearly identify student problems in the problem identification stage. We want to then be using some of those assessment techniques that we discussed in terms of the problem analysis phase, right? So to clearly identify the root cause of the problem and, factors maintaining or contributing that. Then we want to develop a plan that is going to be matched to that problem analysis, right? So a plan that is matched to that student need that's going to best support that student in that area. And then importantly, we want to implement that plan and evaluate its effectiveness. And that's going to require some ongoing progress monitoring data of some kind, as well as some kind of measure of fidelity. So this is how we operate on all of our day-to-day practices as a school psychologist, whether it's multidisciplinary evaluation, consultation, or kind of monitoring student progress, whether they be identified students or not. And one thing to note too is that the problem-solving process is really going to focus on those salient and alterable environmental factors as opposed to student demographics. And this is, again, is another way that comprehensive psychological services can support delivering equitable services in your school. So Dr. Amber Green, she did one of our behavior bites this summer for Patton talking about equitable MTSS implementation. She says that equity in implementation is MTSS. And when data is used for decision making, that's the cornerstone of equity. And when we disaggregate our data and generate risk ratios, we can then identify where disproportionality exists in our system, and then we can problem solve around that. So again, a problem solving process is going to support some equitable service delivery. So curriculum-based assessment is a set of measurement activities that uses direct observation and recording of a student's performance in the local curriculum, although not always, as modern iterations of that have kind of moved to more standardized materials and assessment practices. But anyway, it's going to use direct observation and recording of a student's performance in the local curriculum as a basis for gathering information to make educational decisions. So curriculum-based assessment is an umbrella that includes other assessment models such as curriculum-based measurement, curriculum-based evaluation, instructional assessment, and curriculum-based assessment for instructional design. And we feel that these are well suited to address some of those assessment practices in pillars 1 through 4. So this isn't to say that traditional norm referenced assessment may not be relevant to psychological services. However, those types of assessments are likely going to be more useful for summative decisions and high stakes decisions that maybe occur at the initial evaluation point or at triennial evaluation periods, right? When we're doing our reevaluations. And those might be more useful for things such as determining when a student may be ready to be exited from services or potentially move to a less restrictive setting. as opposed to that ongoing design and monitoring of student interventions and our IEPs. So CBA models are just going to be more applicable for ongoing student assessment that is going to recur within that annual IEP cycle, such as progress monitoring and present levels of performance, or maybe some type of diagnostic assessment that you would want to conduct if a student doesn't seem to be responding to the interventions you put in their IEP. Right. And when we think of the reason for that, it's because CBA is designed to be a little bit different than that normative assessment that we use for more eligibility decisions and normative references. So it's going to reflect how the behavior is going to appear in the natural environment. It's going to directly test what's taught. It should help link to intervention and solve problems. It's going to be able to be administered very frequently to kind of monitor progress. And then we're thinking now, we're getting away from like normative comparisons and like how does this student in general compare to a sample of typical same age peers, to kind of more of that idiographic assessment model where we're looking at individual student needs and variables and what can we adjust individually for this student to make them successful. It's going to show both skill and deficit. And again, a lot of these have multiple uses that you can screen. They can be part of determining an eligibility. They can be used to set goals. You could use them at the classroom level to evaluate programs and interventions for group of students. And obviously you can use them to kind of develop and match students to intervention. So because of all of these things, CBA is generally more well-suited for ongoing psychological services because of that efficiency and the frequency that it can be administered and that direct link that it has to intervention. And again, linking that back to kind of equity in service delivery, focusing on that idiographic assessment model is going to lead to, it's going to be less biased than norm referenced assessments. And it's also going to develop better matched student interventions that are, can be evaluated and adjusted based on student need. Right. So within CBA, CBM are probably, I'm sure everyone's familiar with them, and hopefully I'm assuming they're pretty widely used in terms of IEPs and progress monitoring. And that's because they're very useful for this, because they not only can be administered efficiently and repeatedly, but they have some technical adequacy to them as well, right? So they're a little bit more defensible than some more informal assessment approaches, right? We know that they're reliable and valid measures, and we know that the growth rates that they produce have known reliability and validity as well. So these are some reasons why CBM are really particularly well suited for psychological services and IEPs as well, because not only does it have all those qualities that you like in a progress monitoring tool in terms of being efficient, aligned to your standards, and can be administered very quickly and repeatedly, it also is technically adequate, and it has empirically based benchmarks that we can use as a criterion reference, or we can also use norm referencing with CBM as well. So they kind of, they dip into both worlds. They have properties of CBA, and they also have properties of more traditional normative assessments as well. In thinking of consultation, we're talking again about an indirect service delivery model. And the idea behind consultation is that we're going to improve student outcomes by working collaboratively with teachers and other school personnel to improve their ability to meet students' needs. So psychological counseling services as defined in IDEA and the NASP practice model also call for the provision of consultation at the group and systems level. And these can also have a focus on preventative services as well. So it's not just about the individual student. Consultation can be used at a variety of levels to support students functioning and promote just wellness and resiliency at the group level. So the advantages of using consultation, again, is that it has this method of prevention and intervention. But through a consultation model, school psychologists can potentially impact more students than trying to intervene directly with all individual students that may be on their caseload. Another advantage of that too is that it can improve consultee skills for future situations. So if you're doing consultation, possibly with an emotional support teacher around implementing some evidence-based strategies to manage that classroom, hopefully those improvements stay with that consultee, and they're able to apply those to future situations and future students. So it allows you to impact a much broader range of students with your knowledge and expertise. And it also just provides ongoing support and feedback to teachers as they're working with students, many of whom can present with some very challenging learning and behavioral needs. So it is just an ongoing support for teachers as they attempt to meet the needs of a very diverse set of learners that they're probably experiencing. All right, and then function-based assessment, again, is going to be important in particularly pillar 6, but also pillars 1 through 4. And when we're thinking about functional behavior assessment, we're talking about the systematic and formal use of evaluation to identify the functions of behavior. And simply put, this is a process for understanding the variables that contribute to the occurrence of interfering behaviors. So what are the maintaining consequences of interfering behaviors that we see? And what are the antecedents or environmental triggers, so to speak, of those behaviors? And similar to curriculum-based assessment, function-based assessment is probably better suited to the provision of like an ongoing psychological services than norm reference behavior assessment, like behavior rating scales. And again, this is going to be due to its ability probably to be more directly informative of behavior intervention plans, as well as its focus on the individual level. So we're moving away from kind of group comparisons to very detailed individual accounts of what seems to be interfering in the environment with the students' display of appropriate behavior. Dr. Kruger, I see you popping up, so I'm assuming you have some questions that you want to answer.
I was going to say, can we just pause a minute to take a couple questions? Is that okay?
Yeah, it works for me.
All right. So I just wanted to get to a few. I'm trying to get to some here in the chat. If providing counseling services, do we need to have goals within the IEP? And I think you started to touch on this.
So again, you're going to touch again. This is everyone's kind of peeking forward to day 2. They went the day 2 content. That really depends. So not all psych counseling services, when we're thinking about those broad, those 6 pillars, not all of those require a goal per se. Some can be SDI, some can be supports to school personnel, some can just be, like listed, identified that way in the IEP. When you get into counseling though, you're probably getting into a territory where you're going to want to have an identified goal for that student. And that can be kind of difficult because counseling can cover like multiple skills. It's conducted kind of over time. You may not focus on the same set of things. It can be hard to turn that process sometimes into a measurable goal for an IEP. But again, I would think if you're working directly and individually with a student in that capacity, it's probably a good idea to have a goal. And we're going to talk tomorrow about some really effective and efficient ways to kind of like progress monitor and write those goals as well. Because I think that can be some of the hang up with counseling.
Yes, we are going to spend some more time on that tomorrow. Had another question. I think we're going to be getting to this shortly. There are definitely limits to ideal time allocation and the actual broad demands of school psychological or counselor or school social work services that can interfere with a team or administrator's understanding of limits to counseling referral numbers. Does a teacher or administrator automatically assign a student to counseling even though their data may support it? What ethical code dilemma would apply here without clear guidelines and personnel advocacy that limit the integrity availability of counseling? student stage of change and assent consent process. So I think there are a couple things in here. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you unpack that maybe into one question at a time?
Yeah, so I think the one question, and there was another question, not exactly like this, but similar, as far as school counselors and thinking about their role in the ASCA model. I think one thing that's important to understand as we look at ratios, for example, there are recommended ratios to be able to provide a comprehensive service delivery model. And school infrastructures may not be set up for that type of model. And so it does make it very difficult. And having some conversation with administration, with them understanding, the full continuum of services that can be provided, whether you're a social worker, whether you're a school counselor, whether you're a school psychologist. But if you have a ratio, you're one school psychologist to 3,000 students, for example, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about, how to advocate. Advocacy is definitely necessary, but, keeping in mind their ideals, and then there are where schools may actually be functioning. There are some schools over time that have moved to that they've been able to fully allow staff to work in the full ASCA model, to work in a comprehensive service delivery model under NASP. Same thing for school social workers, but you have to look at what resources do you have available, what are the needs, who are the people that can provide those services, what is the IEP team determining. So I think definitely it needs to be a team decision with multiple sources of information considered. Without clear guidelines and personnel advocacy. So I think getting back to that availability of individuals who are trained and qualified to provide that continuum of counseling services. And sometimes it is necessary to partner with our community providers, as we'll talk about that as well. But that kind of has been popping up a little bit.
We are going to discuss some barriers to implementation and some things that potentially can be done to, maybe create a case for, pursuing resources to expand the school's ability to provide like this continuum of services. We will be discussing that at the conclusion of today. So I don't want people to get anxiety, like feeling like you have to leave here and immediately in your practice start implementing all of these things. And maybe if you're in a district where your main role is that gatekeeper role, where you're mainly doing assessment and things like that, you're not going to change that or turn that around overnight. And you're certainly not going to do it on your own. It's not just going to be a matter of like, well, I'm just going to go back and do this. There has to be some things in place in your district to support providing these continuum of services. And some of that may be, staffing ratios, and we'll talk about that too. But as Dr. Kruger suggested, there are other resources to consider outside of just you as the school psychologist. There are, community partnerships that, there is that other qualified personnel kind of snippet under the counseling services. So there are community partners and providers that can do that as well. And I also, I just, my own personal, like not all problems need an individual counseling intervention. And possibly in collaboration with families, students may be able to get those resources via community-based service providers. And this, working closely with those providers, schools can support the skills and the transfer there, possibly through positive behavior intervention plans, prompting and scaffolding, coping skills and other behaviors, right? So it doesn't, I don't want everyone to think too that every problem has to be met with an individual intervention. And the other thing too is that designing well-designed environments instructional match, positive school climates. There's lots of things that can be done outside of working and trying to change an individual child that can promote improved functioning in a student. That so you can do lots of things maybe that you do possibly have more time to do than trying to meet with every student individually to support those students functioning better in their current settings. So
Yeah,
and then there was
great.
one more component of that question, I think.
I was going to say one more thing is, as you talk about that instructional match, and that's so important, we did have a question about DIBELS. Do you want to suggest a few resources for CBA, CBM?
Sure. What was this? Yeah, sure. You want me, don't twist my arm and make me talk about
I know.
America. What was that specific question?
So would DIBELS probes be good to use for CBA? I just thought this might be a good point to talk about. There's some commercially available ones, or how to do some of your own if you don't have those.
Yeah. So DIBELS, I mean, it can be part of a curriculum-based assessment workup that you might do with a student, but those probes are probably those are more like curriculum-based measurement, but how you could use them as part of like a survey level assessment to start drilling down to where students' areas of needs are. And then with younger students, obviously you can get into those sub-skill measures like nonsense, word fluency, phoneme sag, and start identifying some skills there. Additionally, you might want to consider some more kind of like mastery measures or accuracy-based assessments. I don't want to endorse products. You can always kind of find the tools and make them yourselves, but like the core multiple measures is really good for reading. University of Minnesota has the PRESS, that's the Path to Reading Excellence in School Sites. And these are sets of measures that are good for identifying they're good for that CBA, CBM kind of assessment model. Intervention Central is a place where you can get some free resources outside of a commercially available platform like a DIBELS or an AimsWeb or a FastBridge. You can go to Intervention Central and they have the CBM warehouse. You can make a lot of your own CBM for math. You can make them for writing. They have norms and directions on there. And then some of the like instructional assessment doesn't really require you to purchase anything. That's Gickling's model. It was formerly CBA for instructional design, and then he moved it into instructional assessment. And then Matt Burns kind of picked up the CBA ID and took it that way. Ken Howell's model, curriculum-based evaluation. That's something that you don't need. That's something that you don't need to necessarily buy anything for. You can kind of use your local curriculum to create some assessments. So there are some resources that you can look into outside of things that you have to purchase for that as well. But yeah, DIBELS would be a good tool. One of the tools that if I had access to, I would certainly use DIBELS, and probably in conjunction with a couple of other things if I was trying to do like some present levels for a student. So hopefully that answers that question somewhat clearly.
All right, awesome. So I'll turn it back over to you to continue talking about FBAs.
All right. Yeah. So again, yeah, just thinking of like as part of the psychological counseling services, it's not always going to be normative based assessment. We're looking for things that we can do a little bit more frequently, and they're going to be a little bit more individualized in terms of what the information that they tell us. And the reason the FBAs are so powerful is because we know that they work, right? Behavior plans that are based on things like practitioner preference or diagnostic classifications like ADHD or something like that, or previous success with behaviors that maybe looked similar. And we also know that there's a lot of fads and unproven theories that get into education that become popular and implement as well. We know that those are likely going to be ineffective, right? And that when we develop our behavior plans based on behavior function and we match those supports to that behavior function with a replacement behavior, we're going to get much better results. And then if we're basing our behavior plans based on topography, right, like what that behavior looks like, we're often going to get into a place where we're going to need artificially strong reinforcement and really intrusive punishment to compete with the actual environment, the naturally occurring environmental reinforcers that are maintaining that behavior. So that's why we really want to be moving to that function-based assessment and doing behavior plans based on function, because that's going to alter the motivation to engage in the interfering behaviors. It's going to minimize the access to the reinforcement that's maintaining them. And it's going to provide some socially appropriate reinforcement for some socially appropriate alternative behaviors as well. And again, when we focus on immediate and alterable environmental variables, that's getting into more individual planning, and that should support equitable practice by placing the focus of the intervention on these variables instead of maybe broader conceptualizations of student behaviors. Like when we get into things of like family background and socioeconomic status, et cetera, those are status variables. We're not changing those about a child. And when we get too hung up on those, we kind of miss what's right in front of us, which are those alterable environmental factors that we can manipulate to make students more successful. So that's why FBAs are a very powerful tool. So here, and again, so when we think kind of back to like the one question that came up, and when we're thinking about what we're talking about psychological services, really only one pillar there refers to directly intervening with students in like a counseling kind of intervention. That being said, that is an important pillar, and it's also a true need for a lot of students, because we know that mental health needs are a frequent barrier to many students accessing their education. And additionally, there can be many barriers that prevent students from accessing these services outside of the school setting. Right? So providing them in school can make sense for a lot of students. That being said, the counseling services tied to an IEP, they should have somewhat of a different focus than those provided by a community provider. So we're focusing on things that are kind of more immediate to this child accessing their education, as opposed to like more broader things that like developing insight or possibly family functioning or something like that. But you know, these can be an invaluable and essential role of school psychologists and other personnel in schools that support student learning. So in addition to some of the statistics that you can see on the screen here, over 1/2 of all lifetime mental illness diagnoses first manifest themselves during childhood and adolescence, right? So 50% of mental illness is going to first appear while children are in school. Up to 3/4 of all those are going to occur before the age of 24. So all this means is that schools are faced with the challenge of educating a significant amount of students who have emotional and behavioral barriers to learning and other aspects of functioning in the educational setting. So this may be a very important role that you could provide as a school psychologist or other related service providers, such as school counselors or social workers in your schools. Okay. So now we're going to kind of talk about some of the things that were being hinted at in like, how do I do this? I'm a school psychologist in a district, and I'm the only psychologist in that district, and it's just me and 2,000 students in that district. So we're going to talk kind of briefly here about the need to kind of expand our roles to be able to provide these services and what all that might entail. And as we're discussing this too, again, this is specific to school psychologists, but keep in mind that we do know that this is a barrier for school counselors and school social workers as well. And the process that we're outlining here for school psychologists to advocate for their increased role and availability in schools can also be used by school counselors and school social workers by accessing similar information and information from your professional associations as well. But what we're looking at here is the most recent summary of the NASP Professional Practices Survey. And for those of you that aren't familiar, I think every 5 years or so, NASP surveys the field, and they ask a variety of questions, but one of the things they really get at in these surveys is how are school psychologists spending their time, and what seem to be the main activities that school psychologists spend their time in. So this publication, and this can be found in the Padlet and also on the NASP website, is from the most recent Professional Practices Survey conducted in 2015. And I think, not surprisingly, approximately 90% or greater of school psychologists report engagement in special education related services. But when we look at that, what are school psychologists really doing? And you can see if you access the whole report and survey, there's a lot more information than what we have up here. We've just provided some snippets that really show that conducting individual evaluations for eligibility is where school psychologists still seem to be spending most of their time. And this was consistently rated as quite a bit. But when we get into those other services that would represent those more expanded roles and be consistent with some of those psychological services in IDEA and some of those services in the NAS practice model, we're getting down into the somewhat and rarely territory. So consulting and collaborating with teams to develop student support somewhat, providing mental and behavioral health services somewhat. But then when we get into systems work, and using systems data like program evaluation, and then even providing supports and services to family, we're getting ranked. That's being identified as rarely a function of many school psychologists. And as we know, those are important services, right? Because we need to develop schools and systems that can meet the needs of diverse learners. Again, if we're supporting students in the least restrictive environment, we need to have solid systems and classrooms for them to be supported in. And families are going to need some support and help with this as well. And all of these would fall under one of those 6 pillars of psych services as outlined in IDEA. So these are some areas that we probably need to increase our activities in if we're going to implement that continuum of services that's outlined in IDEA. And as I think on everybody's mind, we know that there is a direct relationship between the role and function of the school psychologist and student ratios, right? The higher that school psychologist to student ratio is, the more likely that school psychologist is going to report being engaged primarily in special education eligibility determination activities, okay? And according to the McNamara et al. Summary, when we got to that 1 to 1,500, that's where we started to see some shift there. However, we know that ratios below 1 to 1,000 show a very clear relationship with expanded service delivery compared to other groups. So 1 to 1,500, we start to see less time in those special education roles, but it's really at that 1 to 1,000 where we really start to see more of an expanded service delivery. And then some additional research, this was, I believe, conducted in Wisconsin, the Eklund et al. Study in 2017, supported that ratios of 1 to 700 resulted in significantly more time spent in school-based, I have a typo there, school-based mental health activities. And as many of us are probably aware of, the recommended ratios by NASP are 1 to 500 to 700. So that's kind of the optimal number where you're going to see availability for your school psychologist to be doing a broader range of psychological services outside of just eligibility determinations. So how do we get there? This is likely going to require some advocacy on your part. So as always, with school psychologists, we're going to start with data, right? Data to support the need for why we might need to have an expanded service delivery model. It might be helpful to conduct a needs assessment in your district as well. Again, trying to provide that rationale of support for why should we, invest resources in maybe more school psychologists or more school psychological services. And then we want to look at costs and benefits of implementing this model as well. And that could be financial costs or, and benefits or other benefits too, just in terms of student outcome data and things like that. So some data that you may want to consider, a lot of this should be readily available to you. Some of them can be found online. Some you may have to collect yourself. But PAYS data, that's the Pennsylvania Youth Survey, if anyone's not familiar with that. And that looks at a broad range of student and community attitudes towards alcohol, tobacco, drugs, mental health, etc. And that can provide some good data about student behavior and just general community perceptions. And I'm going to take you out to some of these websites just so you can kind of see what type of information you can get there as well. And the links to these should be on the Padlet too. Discipline data is going to be good as well. So you can look at office discipline referrals, look at rates of suspension and expulsion, right? I think disproportionality data is probably something that schools are looking a little more closely at these days. But disproportionality, and we could be looking at racial ethnic disproportionality, but also looking at disproportionality in outcomes in students identified for special education. Trying to make that argument that these students could benefit from my support in an expanded role as a school psychologist. Your school information system is going to have lots of data that you can pull from. You could look at attendance data there. Again, you may have information related to behavior and office discipline referrals in there as well. This is referring to your special education data reports. And this can tell you this will give you kind of identification rates. You can look at statewide rates and you can look at your school's identification rates. So you could compare how many students you may be identifying as learning disabled or identifying as having an emotional disturbance compared to the state average, and see if there are any trends there that could be used to support increasing psychological services as well. We also have SAP referrals. How many students in your school building are being referred to SAP? Thinking again that that's a community liaison that is going to connect students with some community-based mental health services. It's going to give you an overall indicator of how many students in your building may be struggling. And again, you can use that to make the case for more on-site supports to support those students. In terms of special education outcomes, looking at the graduation rates of those students, look how many of them go on to post-secondary education, how many students are being exited from special education, et cetera. Just again, looking at what data you can have to support this idea that your students are going to benefit from more of your services. So in terms of the PAYS website, it's up here. So these links are here. This can take you and you can see the summaries by years. And then if you want as well, you can get county reports. So if at least I believe 2 schools in your county completed it, you can access the report and it will show you the averages for that community in terms of the different questions. So you can pull that up and analyze that too, and just look at, are there any trends in our PAYS data that suggest that we should be doing more, right? So we look at antisocial behavior, school climate safety, social emotional health, and things like that. So there's lots of good data in there to support the need for possibly increasing your continuum of service delivery. And again, here we have the special education data reporting. So you can find your own school's data on there. Or again, you can also see the state average too. So this is kind of the type of data you can see. And again, you can see it by state or by your specific school. You can see your enrollment by the different eligibility categories. And then you can also, it also gives you a breakdown by race and ethnicity. Right? You can look at dropout rates, and then you can look at some things about how students are being supported. You know, are most students at an itinerant support? Do you have a lot of supplemental kids? How many students do you have in out of district placements? Right? So additionally, to looking at some of the data that maybe tell you some specific things about your school and or community and what's going on there, you can also look at needs assessments as well. So there is the MTSS fidelity tool that you can access on the patent website if you were looking at trying to develop a multi-tiered system of support. Again, we talked about that being the best framework to embed this in, looking at students in special education kind of being a part of your tier 3 process there, or at that intensive level. We shouldn't necessarily label it tier 3. You can look at NASP role and function, practice model recommended ratios, right? So you can pull from your professional organization's resource to kind of create an awareness at your district at the local level, whether that be with administrators or school board or whoever you are advocating for, about look at everything I'm trained to do and could be doing. look at what I'm recommended to do by my professional organization, and also here's the recommended ratios that they're saying I should be working with, as opposed to what I'm actually dealing with. And Dr. Kruger has appeared, so we have questions.
Yeah, so I will pop in. There's a question in the chat. Does PDE have a plan to address the shortage of school psychologists in Pennsylvania? So I can't answer specific policy for PDE. We are the Training and Technical Assistance Network for the Bureau of Special Ed. But I can talk a little bit about a project we're looking at partnering with the Special Ed Leadership Initiative for 21-22, and that is in development right now. It's called Attract, Prepare, Retain. And we recognize in the special education world that there are definitely shortages of school psychologists, of special education teachers. So we are really looking at how can we help, as Dr. Hunter is talking about, how can we help advocate and how can we help schools build that necessary infrastructure to support school psychologists in working in an expanded role and function, especially when there's a shortage. So, you know, we recognize there are a lot of different barriers for that. So we know we need to attract people to enter the field. We know we need to help have them prepared to do the role, and we know that we need to retain good professionals. So I'll have Shonda jump in a little bit as well.
Yes, thank you, Erica. So with the Special Education Leadership Initiative in conjunction with school psychology, we do work directly with special education leaders to inform them, thinking specifically of school psychologists, of the broad range of functions that school psychologists can provide to schools and to districts, and also talk to them about how to remove that barrier of monies, finding available applicants for job vacancies, etc. So we're helping our special education leaders, our districts directly to understand how can they broaden in order to attract folks to apply for vacancies. How can they then prepare those individuals to fulfill that broad range of functionality that school psychologists can provide? And then how can we retain them to remain within our districts and remain in our state? So we're already starting on this journey, but like Erica said, next year we want to be even more intentional on how we support districts and special education leaders so that we can address the shortage that we know that we have for special education teachers, related service providers, and school psychologists.
Awesome, thank you. We do have another good question here in the chat. How can we support school psychologists that feel they are not well versed in direct counseling services as a related service? Many feel out of practice, having been forced into assessment-only roles, and may feel this is outside their current scope of practice.
Okay. Shonda, since you're up, did you want to say anything about that?
Well, I know that a lot of our IUs are providing supports for school psychologists specifically for this. I also know that our school psych initiative, we're looking for ways that we can provide more supports to you. Erica, remind me of some of the, we have had some meetups just to provide opportunities for collaboration, to do case studies, etc. And as we are working on our training plan for next year, we want to be even more intentional on providing supports to IUs and providing supports directly to school psychs on how to broaden your array of supports and services that you can provide to your districts.
Yep. In addition to some of those things too, professional organizations, right? You can look through ASP and NASP to see what kind of resources or trainings they might have. The other thing too, I think it depends on your training and your background. How much training and experience did you get with that? And is it something that you just need to brush up on, and you could maybe grab a book or a resource like that and get brushed up on, or is it something maybe that you need to invest a little bit more time? Graduate courses are always an option too, just as like a standalone thing, like not going back to school, not enrolling in a program, but possibly just taking a graduate course in a counseling skill or something like that. I always liked the cognitive behavioral therapy manuals too. If you have at least basic counseling training and some supervision there, those manuals tend to be very kind of, they're pretty well scripted. So, you know, there's a sequence that they follow, the materials are there and kind of prepped. That can be a good way to kind of get your feet wet with some of that stuff too, is to get a resource or a manualized resource that you can use as well. And then again, I would also say too, like what resources exist in your building, in your local context. And perhaps it is that you're not the person that's best suited for direct counseling interventions in your school. Perhaps you are best suited more for consultation or positive behavior support, or some of those other assessment practices that could be tied to IEPs. So I don't want, again, like school psychology is a broad field and you can't be an expert in every facet of it. So maybe that's something that you work on, but maybe your school counselor has better experience in that, and maybe that's the person that provides some of those supports. Or maybe you have a school social worker who's well versed in that, and they provide some of those supports. So there's a couple of things to consider there. And then again, yeah, we do know that that's a need, and it is something we have looked at within the school psych initiative about providing some additional training and resources about that. Sean, I see you've unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Yes, someone just put in the Q&A, and I was thinking along the same lines as mentoring or pairing with a school psychologist as well. So of course, that's always a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add too, if you have a local network in your area, if you're in a large district, or if your IU facilitates school psych networking opportunities, this is a great way, just as in the chat, to do some peer supervision. We often have administrative supervision as school psychologists, but we might not have a supervisor that can provide us with clinical supervision. And so as school psychologists, you know, as Drew was sharing, some people they went to a training program where they've had a lot of counseling training. Maybe this is something you do as a PLC. We often have professional development, and school psych, school counselors, school social workers might get lumped into whatever the professional development is for the day, but this might be a good opportunity to do some PLCs or get some really targeted job embedded professional development around, you know, learning a new CBT approach, or learning a new manualized program across the year, and practicing and just having that opportunity for some peer supervision, mentors in the field. I also think about our university partners as well. You know, collaborating with university partners, maybe that is something they would be willing to do. Someone from a school psych training program that trains on this, maybe that is someone that could help with PLC or some really targeted and customized professional learning to the needs of your school mental health professionals, including your school psychs. I'll be quiet now.
All right. Any other questions?
I will say there are a couple more in the chat, if that's okay. I think I missed this one a little bit ago. What are recommendations for students who are over 14 and have IEP counseling as a related service, who consistently refuse or decline counseling services, but the parents or LEA still believe it's appropriate and needs to remain on the IEP? How can students have more of a voice and make counseling available, but not feel like it's a requirement? Does anyone from our panel have thoughts on that?
I found myself in that situation
Mhm.
several times as a practitioner, and I can say it never really ended well. So there may be, but then you also have this aspect too of well, if we're identifying it as a need, right, are we then not obligated to provide it? But I find that to be a very tricky situation. At some point, like if a student's going to participate in a counseling intervention, they've got to have the motivation to participate and that motivation to then take this, you know what I mean? It can't be done to the student. It has to be done with the student. And I have not seen, generally if they're forced into that scenario, it's unpleasant and that relationship doesn't form and it can be very challenging to get that to be successful. So I do think, you know, at a point, particularly as students get older, like their voice is important. Like this is a service that everyone feels you would benefit for, but how do you feel about it? I mean, is it an issue? Is there a couple of providers? You know, we have an option of people you could work with. And again, there are other interventions that we can implement if that student really doesn't want to do that to try to support them. But I mean, my experience with that is that it usually ends pretty sourly. I don't think I really answered the question other than though, but
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, students become part of that IEP process then, especially as we consider transition. And maybe, you know, one-to-one counseling isn't working for them. So we collaborate with them and find a, you know, maybe it's consultation, maybe it is some type of self-monitoring, and you know we meet with them. But thinking about the continuum of interventions that are provided, I think about conjoint behavioral consultation. Although we often do that with adults, maybe what we provide is a little bit more of a consultation model with the student as our consultee. Just a few thoughts. All right.
yeah, I mean, if the student doesn't want to do that and they're at the team, you can engage them. Okay, this is an option, but you don't want to do this. But what do you need? What can we do to support you? Get them thinking more actively about what can be done as opposed to what they don't want to do.
Yep.
We have a couple
Yeah.
more pop up in the chat.
Okay.
We can do those now or we can do those later.
I was going to say, go ahead, do those now.
We have this one says from Jennifer, maybe this is a day 2 question. Are there guidelines for PCRS with regard to topics, for lack of a better word, or areas that may be outside the scope of schools, e.g. extensive therapy needs related to trauma? So that's a difficult one. Again, if we're identifying it as a need, it may be incumbent on the school then to find that provider. If it's felt to be essential for the student to access FAPE. Would you have a different interpretation of that? Yeah,
I think that what you said is important, is that you have to connect it to FAPE.
yeah.
And I think that might be what might be the best answer to Jennifer's question. So if the scope is outside of what's connected to FAPE, then that might be your boundary or your guideline for that.
Yeah, and you can always work with families to find that resource in the community if you're like, I'm not qualified to provide that service. Like you have to obviously have to know your competence as a professional, but again, there are resources that can be used to help assist families in finding people who maybe are more trained for those more significant types of needs like that. Another says, can you further explain how school counselors can be added as a long-term IEP service? Typically weekly individual counseling for a student or bi-weekly group counseling for the entire year of the IEP if they are not trained therapists. Well, school counselors generally do have some training. I'm puzzled. I guess again, I mean, counseling doesn't necessarily have to be therapy. it can be skills groups, social skills groups, things like that. And those are certainly relevant and have their place within a continuum of services as well. So it doesn't have to be like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? It could be a school skills group, it could be skills streaming, it could be something of that nature, if I'm understanding the question correctly. So, all right. Anything else, Erica?
Let's see, there are a couple things, people kind of agreeing with some of the barriers that are seen. On the opposite side, if students are over 14 and are interested in receiving more parents or receiving more services, but the parent disagrees, are we able to add the additional services?
I think that's kind of the dichotomy there of the mental health world versus the school world. And I believe that even if in special education, right, it's that parent signature on that NOREP, right, that's gonna put those services into place. And I don't think we can implement that without that parent signature in the school anyway.
And we did get a question similar to this before, follow up on the chat. Someone saying they've been advised in the past that school counselors cannot be written into IEPs. Is that true? And if not, how can we change or use them as a resource? Again, someone posted a little earlier, the ASCA model. And we have to consider LEA's capacity to fully implement, whether it's the ASCA model, whether it's the NASP model. Do you have the infrastructure in place to fully implement what each professional organization sees as best practice? And that's definitely a consideration. And it really is an LEA decision, dependent upon what is the service needed, what are the resources available to provide that type of service, if it's in the IEP or not. So again, that really is an IEP team decision.
But school counselors are a qualified personnel under IDEA. So there's nothing in IDEA that prevents them, but it's going to be local context, I guess. That.
Right, and I think the other side is ASCA is saying they shouldn't be doing that. So again, there are some things as far as infrastructure and what your school counseling plan looks like, and what services are being provided, and then thinking about the IEP team decision. As far as, go ahead.
ASCA is saying that school counselors should not be providing counseling connected to IEPs. Is that what the model is saying?
Written into IEPs.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so we definitely get into some dilemmas here. In our school, there is a bit of role confusion about who provides which service to students and who they should be supervised by. We have school counselors, BCBA, school social workers, a special ed director. The special ed director oversees all of the aforementioned. We do not have a school psychologist. How do you see the role of each in the school system? And a hierarchy for supervision. So again, it comes down to resources, and you also have to think about administrative versus clinical supervision. When people are certificated, and Shonda, jump in here with your special ed leadership background, but when people are certificated to provide supervision, it doesn't necessarily mean they have they're able to provide clinical supervision, but they do provide administrative supervision. And I think this would be a great opportunity because there is a little bit of overlap between, what school counselors, BCBAs, social workers can provide. And so really, how do we all partner together? What are the role and function that you see in the job descriptions of each individual? How can they best be utilized to effectively engage in their role and support students most equitably and efficiently. So those are kind of my thoughts, but really considering, who has the skill set to provide what function and what services, and then, their capacity to do that. Any other thoughts, Shonda?
I agree with what you said, Erica. That does need to be a discussion with the special ed director, and really, like you said, thinking about the skills and the capacity of those individuals within their roles and how do they best support students. And as far as supervision, that administrative supervision is different. I know in some districts, folks are supervised by their building principals. Some people are supervised by the special ed director. So that's going to be a local decision how they develop that hierarchy of administrative supervision.
Yeah, great. Another question coming in. I'm just trying to pop up with these. So it's a great question. Where's the line between medical service delivery model and educational service delivery model for the provision of related psychological services? It could be a necessity for students to access, participate in educational programming, but not within the educational scope of practice. I think that is definitely a great point. And when we think about, we think about FAPE, ultimately, when we're thinking about educational programming.
And I think that, I'm sorry, go ahead, Erica.
Go ahead.
I was just saying a little bit further down, someone was saying that with this difference between therapy and counseling as a related services, if it's not adequately explained to parents or guardians as well. So I think there just needs to be clarity when, which I'm glad that you all are here today, when you're talking about counseling as a related service, and thinking about that it is to provide access to FAPE. I can speak from experience when I've had parents and families not understand, as I am providing counseling as a related service for their child, that I am not there to necessarily provide support for family issues. I'm there to help the student receive FAPE. So that's where you really do have to clarify what the related service is for, the limitations to it, et cetera. So having clarity as providers, having clarity from the school perspective with the special ed director, having clarity with families and parents is important.
In regards to Isaac's question too, I think you're also too we have to recognize too that as much as, again, we strive to support students in the least restrictive environment, but the LRE for a student may not be gen ed or even like a traditional public school setting, right? And when you're getting into things like where Isaac's talking about, where those things are going to be or really are necessary for the provision of FAPE, you could be getting into more specialized programming too, and that's part of a continuum of services or I guess placements, so to speak, that are available to support students with these needs as well. So if you have a student where that's truly the case, that it may be, I mean, there are those types of programming options as well for students. So does that make, Erica, Shonda, am I making sense with that? Like you do have like partial hospitalization type programs and things like that may be options for students as well, part of a continuum of educational services that could be appropriate for students. And then just to circle back to the counseling things, did that go? Did you clear that one? The School Counselors Association, I guess, is against long-term counseling, right? So it's kind of supposed to be time-bound and short-term and things like that, as opposed to like being in IEPs for year after year. And if we're thinking about counseling as a related service and using those people, then we should kind of be thinking like, you know, when we're identifying those needs, is this the student that's going to need something short-term or long-term, and you can kind of fit it that way. But yeah, when we're thinking about counseling as a related service, we don't want it should be, there should be a goal that you're working towards and a service and a skill or something like that. It shouldn't just be something that's written into the IEP and then stays there year after year after year. So I think maybe that helps with that issue as well. Is that possibly school counselors could be this person, but it needs to be for more short-term targeted goals and plans, not something that just ends up in there and the kid has counseling services from grades 2 to 12. And that's going to come up tomorrow as well.
Yeah, I appreciate, I can tell all of our school counselor colleagues are posting in the Q&A. So thank you for all of those follow-up resources and quotes and statements. That's really helpful. And I said it would be great if we would have been able to have these sessions in person, because I really think we could have had some good dialogue as a whole group across the different mental health professionals. And just you know, again, we'll get to this tomorrow, but the ability to provide counseling services should also be closely tied to the professional training and competency of each individual. You got it. That's perfect.
Okay.
Okay. All right. We'll let you continue.
All right. No, that's all right. Questions are good. We're close to wrapping up anyway, too, I think. So just in terms of determining your needs as well, NASP has some resources for needs assessments. And that's on their website, I believe. Oh, I just closed it out. That doesn't help. So again, this should be in the Padlet as well, but this is just a NASP resource for assessing school and district level needs. So again, if you're looking to create that argument for expanding kind of these role and functions as well. And again, if you are in a situation too where you are a limited person with limited resources too, if we think too about a multi-tiered system of support, the more we can strengthen our universal supports and have a continuum of supports that are part of our services, hopefully the less need there is for those individual level interventions. Now we know there's always going to be students that are going to need and benefit from those, but if we can get there, if we can build our systems to support more students without individual support, that's going to help in that endeavor as well. But there's just a number of different assessments, needs assessments, climate surveys, and things like that that they have on the website here, and some resources for resource mapping that you can use as well if you're working with administrators or anything on that. All right. Okay. So, and last thing I think that you're probably going to look at is cost, particularly financial cost. Out of district placements and contracted services can, you know, potentially those things add up. And it may be more cost effective to invest in more providers to support implementation of these types of services at your schools than having to rely on out of district types of placements and contracted services for those supports. So a couple of things to consider if you're trying to make an argument in your local context for expanding your role or expanding this continuum of services in terms of psych services at your site. All right, and then obviously engaging key stakeholders is going to be important as well. So administrators, building administrators, central office administrators, community members and parent organizations, community service providers, school board members. Who needs to know about this, and how can those people support you? How can you build support for this endeavor with not just yourself, and get some allies in your school and community on your side as well? And then lastly too, and this kind of came up, is this may provide implementing a continuum of psychological services may require that we learn new skills or as we expand our role and functioning. So again, graduate training programs are going to differ by the amount of emphasis that they place on certain aspects of school psychology and service delivery model. Some may be more traditional oriented in traditional assessment. Some may provide more counseling. Some may have a consultation focus. Some may have a focus on multi-tiered systems of support. So your preparation to do certain tasks may vary just simply by a function of your training. And so even if you're not to say that anyone's getting subpar training, but I don't want to suggest that, but it's not, there may be some things that you have to kind of pursue as a professional post-grad school to implement some of these things as well. And so as we kind of discussed earlier, professional agencies, professional associations that provide training, professional learning communities, patent trainings, and again, there's additional education and certifications, as well as finding senior members of the profession who maybe have those skills that can work with you on implementing them as well. I know a couple of things we have coming up later this month. We have our patent, the School Psychologist's Change Agent series that we're going to talk a little bit more about some curriculum-based assessment measurement issues that school psychologists can use. We also have some equitable practices and MTSS framework webinar series that are running. And we'll, again, as we're developing our school psych training plan for the upcoming year, we will have that. Stay tuned for that, because we'll be having some more resources to support you in developing some of those skills to expand your role and functioning in school as well. All right. So we are going to finish a bit early today, but just in summary, there is a legal basis in IDEA for that expanded service delivery model of school psychologists. We feel that what's outlined in IDEA is consistent with the NAS practice domains and evidence-based practices. MA billing can be used to offset the cost of implementing a continuum of these services, and implementing a well-designed system is likely going to require a shift in role and functioning for most people. And again, it could also require additional resources and allocations of those things as well. So I would like to, in conclusion, before we can open it up for the Q&A again, although I know we just answered most of those, so I don't know how many are still left. Just did want to remind you, we do have day 2 tomorrow, where we're going to look at kind of the assessment process and some of the IEP, progress monitoring, goal setting, and troubleshooting interventions if they're not working as well. So those are the topics that are coming up tomorrow. And Dr. Kruger, I'll turn it over to you.